Welcome to this morning's American Security Project webinar. This will be an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website and sent to those who registered for the event. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please submit your questions to the Q&A box below. With that, over to you, Patrick.
Thank you. Good morning from Washington. I'm Patrick Costello, the CEO of the American Security Project. Welcome to today's virtual meeting. It is now week 6 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we've all seen the images from Ukraine and the footage of millions of Ukrainians fleeing the conflict. It's truly heartbreaking. But we've also seen the courage and resiliency of the Ukrainian people, which is inspiring, and most certainly President Zelensky has emerged as a truly impressive wartime leader. Joining us this morning to discuss developments in Ukraine is Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov. Dr. Mylovanov is currently the president of the Kyiv School of Economics. He previously served as the Minister of Economic Development, Trade, and Agriculture, and he's currently an advisor to the Zelensky administration. We are going to engage in conversation, but I encourage our guests on the line to submit their questions through the Q&A box, as well as the chat function where appropriate. Now, Dr. Mylovanov, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you are on the ground in Ukraine and the connection can be somewhat complicated. So I greatly appreciate you taking the time to help inform our audience on the situation on the ground. And the first question I would pose to you, if you could enlighten our audience on what the situation is in Kyiv, what is each day, each night like for you, your friends, family, and students?
Hello, this is my pleasure to be with you today. And the connection just got spotted the moment you mentioned the question. So I heard the beginning of it and the end. So if you could repeat it would be fantastic. I'm trying to find better connection.
Of course, sir. Thank you. I was just asking you if you could enlighten our audience on what the situation is in Kyiv. What is every day like? What is every evening like and night like for you and your friends, your family, your students? Just give us a sense of day-to-day life.
Yeah, today actually I'm in Lviv and we are traveling around quite frequently. I am going to be in Kyiv in a couple of days back, and I'm at the Ukrainian Catholic University because just as we're having some meeting on something, on some humanitarian relief. But basically, I think what's happening is that for the last 6 weeks, everything has been, every place has been bombarded. It hasn't been a single city, and we stayed in villages. We're moving around because of security reasons. So we stay in a place for a little bit, and then we move to another place and to another place for several days. Every single place, more or less, which has some infrastructure at some point has come under attack. So I don't think anyone has any sense of security. And the air raids warnings and sirens, it's just that you get numb. You kind of don't care anymore. You hear the sirens, it's like, you cannot go to every one of them every 15 or 20 minutes. I was on TV another day and in Lviv about a week ago, and Lviv got bombarded during the TV broadcast, and no one even bothered. And actually it was close. It was 1 mile or 2 miles away that the missiles landed, and then the fuel depot was taken over and some people died. And but people got so used to it, and so it's amazing how quickly people get used to things. So a lot of us are fighting, and the news of people dying and that, and kind of has become also everyday routine. You just hear from that this friend you knew, or friend of a friend, or husband of someone. The stories which still get to us, I think, is about when kids get raped, or we had students at the Kyiv School of Economics who were kept in the basement for several weeks, for 2 weeks, less 10, 14 days without water, so they barely survived. Not even food, just no water. So these things really get to us still. But I think my current reaction to all of this is that we just keep going. we
Yeah.
keep building, rebuilding, resisting, and it's new normal.
So you're joining us from Lviv, where you are holding conversations on humanitarian assistance. And I know that you are in close contact with President Zelensky, his senior advisors, and his inner circle. What do they need in terms of humanitarian assistance as well as military assistance?
So so my just to be clear on, I'm gonna change maybe it will be better. So my connection with this with the administration currently is that I am answering questions as an advisor when different ministries engage us, and we provide, as the Kyiv School of Economics, we provide assistance on sanctions design, on monitoring, on damages assessment, on recovery plans, and so on and so forth. We also provide analytics through the business school to specific businesses, how to recover or how to transform or how to adapt or relocate. So this is very needed daily kind of things. What Ukraine needs overall, I think on the macro level, we need liquidity, and not in terms of debt, but in terms of at least some substantive amounts in terms of grants. And I think our running rate will be between $2 and $8 billion a month. That's what in terms of public finances will be needed. That's a back of the envelope calculation. Let's say our GDP is about 200 billion a year prior to the war. During the war, you probably redistribute through the budget about more than third. Usually we redistribute third. So let's say you redistribute half of it, plus you have some expenses, 10-20% of GDP war expenses, military and munitions and things like that. So you probably need to redistribute about 120. And we're collecting taxes, we're collecting some revenues, but they're much smaller. They're 5 times, 6 times smaller than your usual normal taxes. So that's your calculation. You need about 10 billion per month, and you're probably collecting 2-3. So maybe 5, depending on how things will develop later. And so that's what you need. And you need this money now. Okay, Ukraine has some liquidity and there's some assistance. So the IMF stepped in and different governments and programs stepped in. But overall, looking into this situation that the war is going to go on for months, if not years. And I mean, just to make it clear, this is a hybrid war. And it didn't start yesterday. Just the invasion, yes, but in 2014 there was an invasion, and it was a hot war in the east of Ukraine with different, degrees of hotness, but it's there, and it's probably that's how it's gonna end too. Because after a while, even whatever happens in Russia, whatever happens in negotiations, it's not gonna be like clear cut. Today, the 1st of April, we are done, and everyone withdraws, and everyone, goes to the. We've seen how it did not work in 2014. Did not work, despite the agreements on the contact line, on the withdrawal and everything. Parties have been engaging each other for years after that. For 8 years, and so that's going to be like that probably too. So there's not going to be a clear end to it. Although we all are working on having the most intense phase of the war end as soon as possible, so we save lives. I think every human on the planet, well, I mean human working on this, right, on the planet. So that's the amount that's needed, I think, while it's going on. Then there will be need for recovery. And one point I want to make, I've been already on some groups, including with the US and the European politicians and economists, on how the recovery should be done. And there've been a lot of discussions on conditionality, and conditionality is important. But I want to kind of mention that conditionality is vulnerable to hijacking of Russia or other forces. So I'll give you a specific example how it worked in 2016. There's a conditionality for an IMF tranche, and what Russia does, just before the tranche should be disbursed, escalates in the east of Ukraine. Then our volunteer battalions start attacking Russian-owned banks in Ukraine. So there is a bank run and financial stability issue for these banks. And then the Russian director of the IMF, Russian representative, demand a formal procedure to investigate whether Ukraine meets the financial stability requirements for these banks. Of course, it doesn't. And so the IMF formally requests to provide liquidity to these banks, which are Russian-owned banks, while Ukrainian military is being attacked in the east, so which is politically infeasible. And so, sorry, there's no trench. And so when we design all kinds of conditionality, we should think about it strategically, understand all kinds of games which are being played, because it's not just kinetic war. It's a diplomatic, geopolitical, cyber, economic, and so on and so forth, right? So all of these aspects have to be taken together. And that's it should be strategic design about how to make these things robust to outside influence through the formal procedures which are available right now in these institutions. That's on the macro side. On the micro side, I think shelter is the most important thing, and infrastructure. Infrastructure has to be rebuilt now. We need storage facilities, we need fuel depots, we need shelter and buildings. And of course, all investments are stopped because of force majeure and because the IFIs, international investors, cannot separate the war risk from the commercial risk. So there should be some kind of political will and construction, or framework to ensure the war risk, because otherwise you're stopping the economy and making it more vulnerable. So, and you need to have a decentralized actually rebuilding, and you need to understand it's going to go for a while, and some of the storage facilities which will be built will be bombed, and that's what it is. And we need it decentralized, because if it's not decentralized, it becomes vulnerable to Russian attacks. And if it is vulnerable, right now it's probably one of the best, and I'll be pragmatic here, opportunities for NATO to sort of break the degree or strategic capacity of Russia to be aggressive in the region. And that, of course, prevents some of issues in the future, because that's not a one-time episode. Russia is a regime within a very aggressive military power and is willing to extend this power to achieve its strategic geopolitical objectives. So it's going to continue like that. And it's important for everyone to kind of handicap this capacity, to limit it. And since Ukraine is engaged in a hot conflict, it's better to do it now. And that requires munitions, that requires fuel, that requires food, that requires specific, it's not just defensive weapons, and I don't think it's the right way of thinking. We need tanks, we need helicopters, otherwise Ukraine is going to bleed. There'll be some ceasefire. And it'll just repeat itself 5 or 10 years from now, somewhere in the Baltic or in Georgia or in Moldova or in Poland, you name, or maybe again in Ukraine. So it's simply strategic thinking would imply that one should be very careful about using this opportunity in many ways, unfortunate for people, this situation to make sure that the Russians' capacity to yield to kind of use force in Europe is limited in the future. So that's important. On this level, of course, we need more than just anti-tank or Stinger missiles. We really need high-end weapons, and there is what I consider to be an excuse, saying that it requires training. Of course, it requires training, but start training people now.
Right.
So it will take weeks, months. But we're looking in activities, in active military operations, most likely all the way until the end of the year, if not longer. Different intensity, and you get air defense up. The situation will be very, very different. You don't need necessarily to attack, in a very aggressive manner, but just ensure air defense, that cities are not harassed, and the humans, civilians are not killed in thousands. So that's basically, I think, 3 areas: macro, liquidity, recovery in the future, weapons, plus building infrastructure right now, not waiting after the war is over.
Great. Thank you very much for packaging that out into those 3 distinct baskets. I want to talk briefly about agriculture, and Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. Just what % of the spring wheat planting do you think will occur, considering the state of the conflict? When will this window close? What are some of the limiting constraints here? Because this will be something that is felt around the world as well.
Correct. Food security. I'll start with the strategic aspect. What Russia is trying to achieve, and I will outline evidence towards this, is actually to limit Ukrainians' capability to compete for food security in the food security markets with Russia for Ukraine. So over the last 10 years, Ukraine has increased its the number of people who rely on Ukraine for food security from 40 million in 2012, 2013, before the Crimea annexation and the invasion in the east of Ukraine, to 385 million in 2021. So that means about 5% plus of the world population relies on Ukraine right now, specifically in grains. In wheat grains, in some other, in corn, but let's say in corn, Ukraine provides 18% of the world market, and in wheat, 11. And it used to be 10 years ago. So Ukraine has been a very serious competitive. And if you look at the reports of analysts, Ukraine has been competing in price-wise and quality-wise with Russia, basically limiting and disciplining Russia's behavior. So Russia has actually two economic tools, strategic tools. One is energy, and everyone has felt it now, but also logistics, because a lot of northern China is shipping goods through railroads through Russia, and the southern routes are not enough. But the third tool, which it can use potentially, if it eliminates Ukraine as a major supplier, or at least pushes it back a couple of decades, will be food security. It will be able to destabilize Middle East and some of the Asian countries and some of the Northern African countries if it disrupts supplies or start changing conditions, imposes embargoes and whatnot in the food agricultural supplies. Before that was not possible because Ukraine held sufficient supplies to compete with it, so that there was a disciplining effect. Now, if we go more into a tactical situation, currently there are about 5 million tons of grains in Ukraine stuck in Odessa and around the country. So we're already seeing a major disruption in the supplies, and it will be felt not immediately, but will be felt a little bit further, because currently, of course, there is some storage, there is some inventory, and but the 5%, 5 million tons reduction in supply is substantial. In terms of planting season, Ukraine is doing as much as possible, and the planting season is on the way, not in the areas controlled by Russians, but it's on the way everywhere else, and Russia is really up in arms about it, and that's why we have been seeing over the last week consistent bombardments of fuel depots, because that limits our ability to plant. And this is the time until the end of April. So this is the critical months. If we don't plant the seeds right now, we will not have the harvest in the fall. So that will be a structural change. However, Ukraine has adjusted and uses quite sophisticated techniques, including those which do not immediately put humans in danger. But I'm going to specify how it's done. Except that I will say that a lot of international partners are, are not as good friends as we would like them to be when it comes to the supply of fuel. So we call on everyone not to be afraid to supply Ukraine with fuel, because the cost for the governments and for the political systems further in time in the fall will be higher if we don't have a planting season. And it might not be immediately apparent to some company which is providing something, because they're sitting, they just trade in diesel power, diesel fuel. But essentially, if there's Middle East is enough of a leverage for Russia to, if they start destabilizing it or pushing prices up there, that will have some effect in Europe too. It will be felt in Europe. Plus, Ukraine uses its exports in some countries, including Turkey and some others, where they are not used immediately for processed foods, but they're used for feed for animals, and so that can feed into the meat markets too.
Right. No, I think that's an incredibly important aspect, recognizing that right now is the critical time, and that there are second and third and fourth order effects on this that will be felt globally. Minister, I want to pivot slightly and just get your reaction to something that President Biden said, and I'd just be curious about the reaction amongst those whom you're in contact with on the ground there. When the president in Poland said that this man, Putin, cannot remain in power, the White House obviously tried to walk that back, and there was a reaction to those unscripted remarks. But I'd just be curious as to your reaction. How was that received in Ukraine?
It's not as not as much attention has been paid to it as in the West, outside of Ukraine, because in many ways Ukrainians understand that the West will come to terms with it. That the combination of these three economic aspects: energy, logistics, and food security, plus regime with an aggressive military power, plus nuclear weapons, plus disregard for some kind of basic techniques of handling it, as we have recently seen in Chernobyl, that their own troops kind of have not been trained or instructed how to operate properly in Chernobyl. Plus, there are classified reports that they have actually, I'm not going to confirm or deny it, but I'm going to say it anyway, that it's like the evidence shows that it's likely they have opened the facilities and closed them, either by mining them or doing something else. I don't quite know, because if you look at the data, and then symptoms of this are the following. Early, when they took the control over Chernobyl and the remote data on radiation levels was available, there was a spike, simultaneous spike in all monitors. That means, it can only explain that the doors were open.
Right.
And then it went back to normal. So it means the doors have been closed. And then, several weeks later, we see all kinds of issues with radiation. So they have been doing something there, and it's definitely not just, curiosity explorations, and so that all of this create a really, really volatile situation. And add on top of this, the strategic aspect that, all superpowers currently in the world are essentially economic superpowers. You look at the US, North America, the EU, the UK, you look at China even, we might disagree about the political approaches, but these are fundamentally economic superpowers. The power comes from the economic leverage. Whereas Russia has not got the economic leverage. It can only hijack, again, these three areas: logistics, agriculture, food security, and energy. Plus, it's using refugee crises. It generates now strategically to put pressure on the EU. Plus, it has nuclear powers and has disregard for, threatening it. And its own military doctrine, at least it's talking about tactical use of nukes. So this is something which is not sustainable for the world in the next decade or two. And so fundamentally, it means that the regime has to be, decoupled from the ability to use these tools. In which way it's going to be done, and it's a big challenge for the world, but it is an existential threat in some ways. Maybe not with 100% existential threat, but with non-zero probability.
Great, thank you. Mr. Mylovanov, we've got approximately 5 minutes left. I greatly appreciate you taking the time. I think one of the most important questions here, given that our audience is nationwide, is there's a great depth of outrage and despair and sadness and helplessness that a lot of people worldwide are feeling about the situation in Ukraine. And there's a desire for people to contribute in some way, other than donating money and keeping abreast of your situation and raising awareness. What assistance can the broader public provide for you and your friends and colleagues? I actively follow you on Twitter. I know that you have been noting donations that have been coming in from around the world. What can we do to help support you?
Okay, so I'm gonna, of course, pitch the fundraising campaign. Currently, we have raised $17 million already, which is for a school like ours in Ukraine, with the budget of 3 or 4 a year. This is substantive. Most of it we have spent on medical kits. Medical kits are, these are specific combinations of ingredients there, which are different from your typical NATO medical kit, but they are needed because most people die in the front lines. Unless they're killed immediately by a missile or a cluster munition, they die from bleeding. And so, it's a little bit, the analogy, it's a little bit like masks on the airplane. When the airplane gets depressurized, you need to self-apply a mask to survive and then help others. So we need to have about 300,000 kits. That's the need. We currently, Ukraine has received over 5 weeks, has received only 18,000 of them, of the right combination. We have received maybe hundreds of thousands of the wrong combination ingredients. So, but we can do that, and we have suppliers in Israel, in Europe, in Canada, and in the US, and we are working with them. So please reach out to us and help. We're also moving towards shelter and helping. About 80% of refugees in Europe currently are saying, Ukrainian refugees, that they would come back at the first opportunity. So we need to provide those opportunities, and we're starting a campaign like Adopt a Family, where for $5,000 we basically will provide them, we pay the rent, we will retrain them, find them a job, and so in a year from now they'll be fully operational in a new place. So these are the things. Now, specifically, of course, raise awareness and put pressure on politicians not to be afraid, because their timeline is really usually until the next election. but the strategic timeline for democracies is much longer. We have to make sure that we live in a stable world. Now, specifically, of course, then you can also, let's say I'm from academia, or think tanks. So what you can do, what everyone can do, is to engage in some joint projects. Not only communication or emotional solidarity and support, not only donations of humanitarian relief, but specifically, adopt a scholar, write an op-ed together with a think tanker, invite someone like me to speak to a panel of people like that, and then do something, create something. This is an opportunity to create things. We're starting a Ukrainian Global University, which is an initiative where we pay money to Ukrainian scholars who stayed in Ukraine, as opposed to those who left. Also, we support those who left too and try to find better conditions for them. So there are all kinds of innovative things you can do right now. You are working in a business school, or you have a business, adopt a business in Ukraine, start a project, trade with them, do something. Yeah, it's tricky. You have to have a war insurance, all kinds of things, but there are projects for that.
Thank you, Minister Mylovanov. We have approximately 2 minutes left. I appreciate how efficient you were with those comments. And I guess I'd just like to maybe close with hitting on the news cycle a bit. And, there were talks in Turkey this week, negotiations. There was reporting that there was first signs of significant progress between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators earlier this week, but there was no hint of an imminent end to the war. My understanding is that Ukrainian officials offered to declare permanent neutrality. Obviously, that was a Russian demand forsaking the prospect of joining NATO. They also said that they would discuss territorial claims in exchange for security guarantees. And I'm wondering just if these conditions would be acceptable to the broader Ukrainian people.
So the way the conditions have been formulated is very careful. So it's not that we are trading territory. And I think that's very important for everyone to understand. Europe has been making a repeated mistake in Ukraine, at least for politicians, trying to sort of have a negotiation. We worry when we negotiate with Russia, we worry that they will renege immediately, and they will, use the time and opportunity to regroup or do something like that. And we have seen it. There is evidence. We have signed multiple agreements and ceasefire agreements in particular. I'm not even talking about Minsk 1, Minsk 2. I'm talking about agreements for ceasefire with Russia, and they have not been, they are not implementing them in good faith. So the way we have seen Russia operate is that basically for a real negotiation to start, there should be a decisive victory or a decisive loss. So it should be a decisive battle after which a real negotiation can happen, and we have not seen that yet. Neither Mariupol, nor Kyiv, nor Kharkiv are going to prove a decisive battle for anyone. Something major has to happen. Either Ukrainian forces push back on multiple fronts and axes, or surround a group of military units in the north of Ukraine, or Russia surrounds in the east Ukrainian troops, which is unlikely to happen. So we're, a decisive battle either way is not feasible yet, and so we are up for some time to see the not good faith negotiations, at least from the Russian side.
Mr. Mylovanov, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspective from the ground. Sir, please stay safe and do not hesitate to reach out if the American Security Project can be of any assistance. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for attending this American Security Project webinar. A recording of this session will be posted on our website, along with notes on the discussion.